I'm not actually directly going to speak to the article in this week's paper just gone. Um, what I'm doing for next week's paper is partly to address Peter Kennedy's article on talking about socialism, about distinguishing socialism and communism. And I'm not going to talk about that either, because that's a sort of work through what's in reality, in my opinion, extremely tangled argument, and try and disentangle a tangled argument. It's rather to try and think about the nature of the transition from capitalism to communism. Mm. Now, um, background to this is precisely as the discussions which we've been having in the Forging Communist Unity process. My understanding of these, it's as I say, it's not very clear. We've got comrades have presented a number of different arguments for regarding CPGB's draft program as problematical, which are arguments in connection with the issue of the nature of the transition from capitalism to communism. And some of them are very practical, and some of them are more deep theoretical. And what I'm going to try and talk about, I think, is slightly more deep theoretical angle to it. I don't know how useful it'll be, but I hope it'll be to some extent useful. Mm. So my starting point is that it appears to be the case, and I'm not going to say that this is certainly the case. It appears to be the case that the difference is the old difference between a political revolution first model and a socialization first model. Yeah. I say it appears to be this is the case because uh, the comrades from TA talking about socialism are particularly concerned about the lack of insufficiency of socialization proposals in the CPGB's draft program, and in particular the fact that we overtly say that we're not in favor of instantly taking over the assets of the petty bourgeoisie. We're in favor of a process of socialization of the assets of the petty bourgeoisie, which is as quick as possible, but as slow as necessary, and as slow as necessary because, of course, there's a whole there is a difference in essence between people who become self-employed simply because the true employer has forced them to take on a self-employed legal status in order to make life easier for the in reality employer, um, what's called in law sham self-employment, of which there is a great deal. There's masses of people who are sham self-employed. Um, and on the other hand, however, there are significant numbers of people who've gone into small business, having been reasonably successful as workers and progressed forward to junior managerial positions and made some savings of one sort and another, who go into small business in order to be their own, quote, their own person, in order not to be in subordination to someone else, to escape from subordination. And these people who have gone into small business in order to escape subordination rather than just in order to make a living in circumstances where they can't get a paid job, are likely to want to resist being incorporated in socialized projects, um, precisely because the reason why they've become petty bourgeois is because they want to be their own boss, and so on, all the stuff which goes along with that. Okay, so that's issue one. It the argument is, and I can see the argument, it's a perfectly good argument in a sense. There's one of the arguments that workers who work for small businesses are just as much shat on as workers who work for British Leyland up the road, well, sorry, BMW up the road, um, and indeed actually more likely to be shat on than workers who work for BMW up the road, and so on. So that's, but at the same time, the question which is being posed is socialization right now. Yeah. And the issue then is, do we say that there's political democracy without it having to involve uh, instant socialization of everything, or very quick socialization of everything within a year or two, and a process of socialization, nach und nach, as they pushed in the Communist Manifesto, bit by bit, um, or alternatively, uh, um, so politics first, which is, among other things, actually, I reviewed Bruno Leipold's book on Marx and republicanism. Is Marx's line, certainly is Marx and Engels' line, is politics first line, whereas the socialization instantaneously line was Bakunin's line. And the fact we shouldn't say that it's an insult to associate it with Bakunin, because Bakunin has some legitimate criticisms of the Marxists, and the fact that Bakunin personally um, used anti-Semitic arguments against Marx at one point or another, or personally attempted to persuade the Tsar to advocate to promote communalization. It doesn't mean that we should say that saying that people are following Bakunin's line is an insult to them. It's an analysis of the nature of the difference. In fact, when we push back and we look at Rosa Luxemburg in the mass strike, Rosa Luxemburg in the mass strike is perfectly explicit that Marx and Engels' criticisms of the Bakuninists in the 1870s are superseded by the demonstration of the importance of mass strike movements in the early 1900s. So we have this difference, which it seems to me is about. I'm saying it seems to me is about um, politics first approach or socialization first approach. We have got the socialized. Other people have argued for the socialization first approach. It's not just Bakunin, obviously. It's also Parvus in state industry socialism in 1911-12. And it's been a running issue in any case. But the way in which it posed this question poses itself is actually a question about the transition from capitalism to communism, and it poses itself one that in one way that CPGB's draft program is unorthodox because we don't posit as critique of the Gotha program posits a phase which Marx calls the first phase of communism, in which the means of production are entirely owned by, entirely statized or entirely socialized or entirely owned by the working class, but payment is still on the basis of wages. That is to say that the distributional principle of the society is from each according to their ability to each according to their work. We don't posit that. We say, on the contrary, that there's a transitional period which continues to be the dictatorship of the proletariat until the point at which we transition into from each according to their ability to each according to their need. And so we regard the transition period as not involving this first phase of communism, in which there's payment by labor tokens. Second, of course, is, as I said, the issue of the immediate expropriation of the petty bourgeoisie. And one of the arguments which is presented against our position is that in order for the communists to be on the verge of taking power, it has to be the case that the petty bourgeoisie is marginalized, and either the petty bourgeoisie is marginalized because of the extent of proletarianization, and or alternatively that the petty bourgeoisie is marginalized in the sense that the obvious supremacy of socialism as an alternative, of communism as an alternative to capitalist society, means that it's easy to win over the petty bourgeoisie without making economic concessions to them. Okay, so I'm going to go step by step slightly through reasons why we shouldn't believe either of these things. But at the same time, also, something which I've said previously, we shouldn't underestimate, we shouldn't imagine that what the draft program proposes is sort of Western European we take power and then we have Western European social democracy as it was in the post-war period, with large amounts of industry nationalized, but rather substantial private capitalist sector. So I start with very basic historical materialism, and the question which is posed is why are social orders like slave owner urbanism in classical antiquity and ancient China, or like feudalism in the Western European Middle Ages or the Japanese Middle Ages, or like capitalism, why are social orders replaced? And it seems to me that there are two arguments which we can find in Marxism for why social orders are replaced. The first of which is that a rising class develops which replaces the class leadership of the declining class. So we can see the rise of the landlord class as a class in later antiquity, and indeed actually in ancient China, and of the other side of the coin, which is a clerisy founded on universalistic religion, which we can see in the rise of Islam, but also in China in the rise of Buddhism, and in Japan in the actual victory of Buddhism, in Western Europe in the actual victory of Christianity. So that the rising class displaces the old class order and the old state which is associated with the old class order. The second is that the old social order declines, and the effect of the decline of the old social order is not stagnation, but rather that the forces of production turn into forces of destruction, which in essence means, to put it bluntly, that productive warfare which extends the existing order of production, extends the existing social relations, and tends on the whole to develop the forces of production, is replaced by warfare which tends to destroy the forces of production and not to provide a tendency towards expansion. And we can see that actually again in the character of the warfare in the Roman Empire from around about the 170s Common Era through to the collapse of the empire in the West, and actually continuing to the collapse of the empire in the East in 1453, with the difference being that the West, the new social order takes hold. In the East, it just declines and declines until the Islamic power, which is not dissimilar to it, takes over. Equally, in the last years of feudalism, we get in the past we get extended destructive warfare, which is not extending the mode of production or the relations of production, but is just is merely destructive. We can see that sort of approximately from the 1350s onwards. And if we ask the question, what is the driver of tendency for social communism to replace capitalism at the present period in time, we have to ask it about the world. What we have to ask it about the world economy, world society, and not just about any single nation state. Why? I make the point. It's a point made by Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto. United action of the leading civilized countries, at least, is one of the first conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. Or in Critique of the Gotha Program in 1875, 150 years ago, um, the framework of the present day national state, for instance, the German Empire, is itself in turn economically within the framework of the world market, politically within the framework of, of the system of states. Mm. Um, or equally, that the need for international action of the proletariat, which is posed in the uh, preamble to the rules of the First International, etc., etc., etc. The problem which the left has, and this is not just a problem of the official communist left, but of the Trotskyist left as well, that it's infected with methodological nationalism and a failure to recognize the objective unity of the world economy, and therefore projects which are designed to be political projects for political projects in a single country. Take for a moment the tariff standoff between the United States and China. Trump has temporarily blinked. Why has he temporarily blinked? He's temporarily blinked because his advisors have told him that if he actually cuts off Chinese imports, US stores are going to be emptied of consumer goods for sale, and it's going to be enormously unpopular. But at the same time, the extent to which the Chinese seem to have blinked rather less than Trump, though um, they have also blinked. It is also the case that if no Chinese goods can be sold to the United States, that's a very bad thing from the point of view of the Chinese economy. I'm going to come back to the issue in relation to the transition of the centralization of world capital, but the point about the degree of integration of globalization, of centralization of world capital, the consequence of it is that we can neither effectively judge the development of the working class as a class on the purely national scale, nor effectively judge the development of the decline of the forces of production and the tendency of the forces of production to turn into forces of destruction on an effectively national scale. Um, so thinking about what drives the transition. Mm. If we think about the proletariat as a rising class, we've certainly got proletarianization on a world scale. I want to be absolutely clear about that. That this is very clear that if anything, actually, the share of the proletariat in the former colonial countries, the places which were thought of as the backward countries, has radically risen. The non-European share of the proletariat has radically risen in the last 40, 50 years. Mm. At the same time, certain institutional forms, which are proletarian institutional forms, have become normalized. Now, that's not quite the same thing uh, as the proletariat just strengthening. So, for example, it is unusual now to have open illegality of trade unions. The fact that Trump is thinking of openly illegalizing, Trump and his co-thinkers are thinking of openly illegalizing trade unions in the United States, that's a very unusual course of action. But at the same time, the trade unions stand in relation to capitalism in exactly the same way that the boroughs, which were originally organizations of bourgeois class struggle, stood in relation to feudalism. That is, that they've been captured by the feudal state and are run by people who are the labor bureaucracy are the equivalent of the merchant princes who supported the feudal states against capitalist revolution. Nonetheless, overall, we have to point to a very substantial rise of the proletariat on a world scale. Istvan Mesheros made the point in Beyond Capital that Marx had made actually in the 1850s. We're devoted to a party which cannot come to power because if it came to power, it would be forced to carry out petty bourgeois measures. And it cannot come to power because the creation of socialism in Europe would be the creation of socialism in a small corner of the world, which would inevitably be outweighed and marginalized by the objective tendency towards the development of capitalism outside of Europe. Secondly, however, if we think about that, the Russian Revolution does not take place because of the radical advance of the proletariat. It needs the proletariat to have advanced, and the proletariat has partially advanced. But what drives the revolution is precisely that the forces of production are turned into forces of destruction. That's what the meaning of 1914-18 is, and of 1939-45, and actually of the wars since roughly 1975. And the forces of production turned into forces of destruction. The result is to create desperation, which means that you don't just get the strengthening of the working class producing the working class. We don't just want a bigger slice of the cake, we want the whole goddamn bakery, to borrow a slogan from May 68. But we need to do something about the desperately bad situation which we're being put in by the destructive power of capitalism. In that sense, socialist revolution in the 21st century will inevitably be driven by the same dynamics. The overwhelmingly most probable outcome of the 21st century is human extinction through globalized nuclear exchange as a result of the United States pushing too far. If the second most probable possibility is that the United States succeeds in pushing, the Russians don't have the nerve to drop the bomb, the Chinese don't have the nerve to drop the bomb on the United States, and the result is successively breaking up and deindustrializing the Russian Republic and turning it into a series of Somalias, and breaking up and deindustrializing the Chinese People's Republic and turning it into warlordism of the sort which existed of the multitude of petty generals commanding this, that, and the other territory in interwar China. I.e. equally Somalifying it. And then once that happens, then the next target is continental Europe. And the target after that is India, Brazil, etc. And we wind up with probably actually we wind up with the generalized nuclear exchange nonetheless happening, but taking place within the United States as the United States eats the body of which it parasitizes, and to the point that the cancer, which is the United States state, destroys the capitalist patient. Okay, so the point of this is we need, if we think about the world as a whole, the question of the transition to socialism is not posed by the proletariat as a class having become so utterly dominant that the other classes are marginalized. On the contrary, in fact, we can see two aspects of deproletarianization. One which is most obvious in this country is deproletarianization through financialization of the upper of the regime. And then, actually, if we look at the class structure in the United Kingdom, we've got, say, roughly 30 million people of working age, of whom about 6 million, 7 million are in business for themselves, whether because they've been driven out and forced into sham self-employment or because they're in business for themselves. Another significant chunk are unemployed. Another significant chunk are workers. The workers, I'm trying to remember who it is, has done a worker survey of the workforce using British government. Workers are primarily in retail. They're primarily in small um, workplaces and offices. The extent to which on the one hand, we were talking about last week, Jack was talking about last week, the extent to which parts for F-35s are UK manufactured, US planes. On the other hand, the flip side of that is the UK firms which manufacture parts for F-35s could not, in fact, manufacture advanced fighter jets because they are specialized. Equally, BMW up the road, the engines all come from the continent. The BMW plant is what the Mexicans used to call a maquiladora, an assembly plant without the structural capability to produce the innards without being supplied from elsewhere. And the consequence of this uh, has been identified by a guy called Dan Evans, talks about the unstoppable rise of the petty bourgeoisie. It is, in fact, the case that the underlying tendency in British society, which was actually already identified by Hobson in relation to the southeast of England in his book on imperialism in the early 19th century, there is a tendency for the British economy to be increasingly parasitic. I said 30 million odd, that's 30 million odd out of around 70 million. And uh, the rest, the other 40 million, we've got the under 18s who are more proletarian relatively, and the over 65s who are by and large rentier. There's a proportion of them, but because life expectancy is shorter for the proletarians than it is for the middle classes are more strongly represented among the over 65s than the working classes are. But equally, if we look at Latin America, we also have deindustrialization, and the deindustrialization we have around the world, the creation of uh, this Mike Davis wrote under the title Planet of Slums. Mhm. We have massive um, levels of unemployment and an enormous proportion of those in work are in the quote informal economy, what used to be called the black market, what Marx called, and I think it's probably incorrect, but Marx called the lumpen proletariat, the end of the market, which is technically criminal. Yeah. So that in that sense, Trotsky is not wrong in 1938 to have said that the forces of production are not only sufficient to socialism, they've also begun to get somewhat rotten. And that somewhat rottenness can be seen in the parasitism of the UK, but actually also increasingly parasitism of a number of other um, imperialist or former top imperialist countries, but also in such phenomena as the great car economy, um, which drives us. It's one of the major contributors to global warming. It drives us, but at the same time, it is also a driver towards individualistic politics and difficulty in reconstruction. So socialism, socialism is going to involve on a world scale the presence of millions. Either it's not going to happen at all because human extinction through generalized nuclear exchange, or will overtake us, or we'll have the reversion to barbarism, or else it's going to involve a very substantial petty bourgeoisie, either the petty bourgeoisie which is created by uh, financialization, or the petty bourgeoisie which is artificially preserved, as is the case of the French peasantry, of the South German peasantry, of the Italian peasantry, and of the artisan classes and the German quote Mittelstand, the bottom end of the German quote Mittelstand. These classes are artificially preserved by subsidy. So the question essentially is that the question of the transition from capitalism to communism is posed not in the sense of hey, here we are in Britain, everybody's working class. Actually, there's been a reduction in the proportion of people in Britain who are properly characterized as working class rather than either small business operators or petty rentier, which is in essence what pensioners, private pensioners, not people who live on the state pension, private pensioners are in essence petty rentier. Um, they're living on, they depend on the continued profitability of stock markets and of capitalist corporations. Or alternatively, societies like those of continental Europe, where there's an artificial preservation of the peasantry for political reasons and of the peasant and artisan classes for political reasons, or in many third world countries where there's massive urbanization, depeasantization, very extensive depeasantization, but people have to live, and the industrial employment is wanting, and they have to live off as essentially by taking in each other's washing / by other operations in the informal sector, by employment in the informal sector. So that we actually the if it's the case that political democracy can't be had without immediate expropriations on a very large scale, then actually the possibility of socialist reconstruction of the society is negligible. Mhm. Um, that's step one. Step two, um, it is, if we think about taking power in England, actually, if we took power in England, there's no great difference from attempting to take power in Devon, because the place is largely deindustrialized, because 45% of the food which is eaten in this country is imported, because the payment for the 45% of the food which is eaten in this country, which is imported, is only the deficit in trade, in visible trade, that's in material goods, is enormous. The actual payment, therefore, for the food which is imported into this country comes in the first place from providing financial and legal services which are exported, so that the City of London runs tax havens around the world, and the city lawyers and accountants and banks uh, operate the various devices to enable the Chinese capitalists to avoid taxation in China by investing in the British Virgin Islands, and British Virgin Islands investing in China, and similar devices in relation to all sorts of other tax havens. And then the guys who actually do the work for designing tax avoidance schemes and managing tax haven operations are paid very generously in the City of London, and the pay of these guys, very generously paid in the City of London, is taxed at 50%. Um, and that tax at 50% is a large chunk of the income of the British state. And it's the part of the income of the British state which is coming from overseas, part of the income of the British state which is coming from overseas operations. Mhm. And that then is spent in welfare operations, in paying for the NHS, in paying for the army, and so on and so forth. And thereby, we all live to a greater or lesser extent on the spoils of British finance capitals. Um, Overseas operations. So if we take power away from the capitalist class, at once these overseas operations stop. At once also the other thing which we do is, because this is a low tax jurisdiction and one which allows very extensive tax avoidance operations as a matter of law, thanks to the Duke of Westminster's case, it attracts foreign hot money to come in to be, quote, invested, unquote, i.e. put into UK stocks and shares, and that transfer of money in fills up. The UK state is able to borrow, and that fills the gap, which enables the UK to have a sort of quasi, not a balance of trade, but an accumulating deficit. So that taking power in the UK on its own is completely delusional. Um, Taking power in Europe um, is probably possible, but we have to recognize again uh, the United States armed forces, the United States State Corps took the view that they were at war with the Soviet regime from 1918 until 1941. Which was reflected in export controls of one sort and another, and from 1946 until 1989. And indeed, actually, quite a lot of the export controls were kept in place after 1949. The United States and the UK, certainly, we don't have, we have good evidence of the UK sponsoring sabotage and terroristic operations in Russia in the first period. After that, the files are no longer disclosed, so we don't know exactly how much sabotage operations the UK state carried on. After the 1939-45 war, these responsibilities pass from the United Kingdom to the United States. But imagine that we take power in Europe. If we take power in Europe, the United States is going to treat itself as being at war with Europe. If we took power in Britain, the United States would treat itself as being at war with Britain. But in reality, actually, as the Corbyn period shows, the United States has the capabilities to take down any political trend in the UK which is inconvenient to the United States simply by political operations. Um, and we shouldn't imagine that that's possible. But then two sides of this arise out of this. The first is Suppose we take power in Europe, the United States takes the view that they're at war with us, but at the same time, they don't actually launch immediate nuclear attack. It is going to be necessary to do war communism, or at least it is going to be necessary to do Kriegssozialismus, the directive planning of the economy that the Germans adopted from 1914, or for that matter, the more extensive, the state planning of the British economy in 1939-45 was actually more extensive than the state planning of the German economy in 1939-45, and in some respects more extensive than the Soviet economy in 1939-45, because the British Ministry of Agriculture was giving, for example, directions what you can plant and what you can't plant, and it had more capability of telling the farmers what to do than the Stalinist regime in Russia had. Mhm. Flip side of this, this is sort of halfway towards the TAS, comrades. We are moving out of the world of welfare states. Immediately, Trump's big, beautiful bill is taking Medicaid away from guys. In the UK, the British state has been driving towards the creation of replacement of state schools with church schools through the academies program, but also through just general dynamics, less eligibility in the secular schools, more funding being available to the church schools. The UK government has already privatised dentistry and is on the road to more or less rapid privatisation of the health services. Now, in this context, actually the workers' movement is going to have to return to the techniques which it developed in the 19th century of building up cooperative facilities of its own. Quite a lot of the NHS was the nationalisation of cooperative and trade union and municipal health services. The consequence of this actually is that the question of cooperatives and cooperative organisation under capitalism, the question of the mutual aid aspects of trade unionism under capitalism, gets reposed in a way in which it hasn't been posed in Western Europe since the 1940s. And we have to return to the construction of such organizations. And in order precisely to address the question, Ant has made the point, any permanent bodies will be integrated by the system. Yes, it's true, but it's possible to counter that to a limited extent as a contradiction by having a political party which is openly disloyalist and which promotes, which fights against politically against the constitutional order and fights against the judicial power, the bourgeois press, the bourgeois media, and so on and so forth. And in that sense, actually, back to the TAS comrades argue that by the time the question of power will be posed to us, the working class will be so strong that the petty bourgeoisie will be attracted to our side. Actually, there's a half truth in that. As we develop cooperatives, as we move away from dependence on state welfarism, and we move away from dependence on state welfarism, but not because of our voluntary choice, but because the state takes it away, we are forced towards an increased centrality of cooperatives in the life of the workers' movement. And if we're forced towards an increased centrality of cooperatives in the life of the workers' movement, that also leads towards the attraction of the petty bourgeoisie towards cooperativization. Now, that it doesn't imply the comrades talking about the general expropriation of the petty bourgeoisie, because it implies the more or less rapid voluntary socialization of the petty bourgeoisie, starting in the process of transition before the overthrow of the capitalist state power, um, and being part of the process by which the overthrow of the capitalist state power looks like an attractive alternative. So from that point of view, it seems to me that there's a strength in what the comrades are saying, but it's a strength which is turned into a weakness by not thinking sufficiently carefully about what drives the need for the transition to communism. That's it.
What I'm going to say may sound as sort of changing the subject, because my point is, as it were, oblique to what Mike talked about, and that is the nature of transition in socio-political terms. I want to highlight the economic argument for a fairly lengthy transitional period. And I think this is what Marx and Engels had in mind when they used this expression bit by bit. The transition from capitalism to socialism / communism economically is indisputably connected with transition from a market economy to a planned economy. If anybody thinks that this is a simple matter that can be done quickly, then they haven't looked at the fact, the experience of the Soviet Union. I recommend that people read a semi-fictionalized account of the problems of planning in the late period of the Soviet Union. That is basically from the Khrushchev period. It is a novel by pseudo-novel by Francis Spafford called Red Plenty, and it details. It is an account of the chaos of the economy of the Soviet Union in this late period. There are basically the problem is replacing the signaling of the supply being triggered by demand. That is the demand for goods and services being fed into the supply of these goods and services via the market, to a feedback of signaling in an economy which is supposed to be based on production for need. It is the problem of signaling the need back to the supply. If anybody thinks that this is a simple problem, they haven't looked at the technicalities that it involves. Basically, in the Soviet Union, there were two failures. The achievement, the great achievement of the planners in the Soviet Union was that they had worked out quite correctly a lot of the mathematical principles that are involved in a planned economy. Why it didn't work was two reasons. Because the communication from the point of need to the point of production was deficient. That is to say, people falsified the accounts, and the communication was broken. That was a problem of the lack of democracy. But there was also another great problem, and that is that although the mathematical principles that are needed for planned economy were known, and in fact, the Soviet Union led the world in the mathematical areas that are relevant to a planned economy, the implementation of these principles needed a huge computing power which was absent at that time. available computing facilities, that calculation facilities that were needed are enormous. And in fact, I think that Marx and Engels underestimated the difficulty in this. Engels in Anti-Düring, someplace, makes it appear as though, oh, what is the problem of a planned economy? We know how much labor is needed to do this, that, and the other. I mean, if you look in detail at what this involves, it involves a huge system of computation and feedback from the point of need, which signals the need for correction, because the system of planning requires a continual correction of the equations that are required in order to meet unexpected and sudden changes in circumstances. I mean, you can't pre-plan for a period of 5 years changes that are required because of weather conditions or earthquakes or all sorts of unpredictable circumstances. In other words, it is a process that can only be done bit by bit, of course, starting with things that are already plannable quite easily under capitalism, such as major transport, such as energy supply. This can be socialized almost immediately. There are also some major parts of the economy, the major inputs that are required for all production that can be planned within a short period of time. But the spread of planning at the expense of the market into all spheres of the economy is bound to take a fairly long period of time. It cannot be done suddenly unless if it is attempted to do it too quickly, it will inevitably result in economic chaos and severe shortages and disappointment of the population, and turning it against the socialist system. So keep in mind this inevitable need for a fairly long transitional program because of simply the exigencies of the transition from the market to a planned economy.
Thanks very much, Conway. I can't see raised hand. Any country? Jack, go. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Yeah, I was going to add. I mean, I agree with Moshe that. I mean, if you take, bar the hacking and the malware, if you take, big supermarkets, they're extremely well planned. As you pick things off the shelf, there's a message going, I presume, to them, like the manufacturer, which could be on a global scale. Mike, you've mentioned, the manufacture of cars, same thing there, that what's going on in Oxford, will affect what's going on. I'm just making this one up, given it's BMW somewhere in Germany or, I don't know, Poland or wherever it happens to be. But okay, so that can be done very quickly. But I agree that it should be viewed as a process rather than a moment. But I'd also make the point that is also true of people. that to, if one thinks about transition, I mean, on one level, transition is happening under capitalism already. You mentioned the NHS, Mike. Okay, it's under attack, but there are elements of the future society in the now. Even if you take the NHS, if it goes and cooperatives and trade unions and mutuals, take their, substitute, that's also an element of the future society. But if you take us as human raw material, we are brought up, even in a party or in a trade union, still with capitalist egoism. That the tendency would be that well, if you went over to need, my need is huge. That would be my, that would be the temptation. And so you need to move towards a society of where you're consuming on the basis of not anyone in charge of you, but responsibly. And I think that is a cultural question. And I think that takes time. So I do think that we're dealing with something that is of necessity drawn out. Now, how long is drawn out? How long's a piece of string? But nonetheless, it isn't an instant process. I also agree with you. Excuse me, I've got a bit of fluff there. I also agree with you on the question of the petty bourgeoisie. There is a process of proletarianization, but there's also the opposite process. And so again, all I would say is, of course, it's certainly true that if we, on a European scale, on a global scale, whatever you want, but if we're in the position of approaching power, then of course you would be attracting elements from the petty bourgeoisie. It couldn't be any, you wouldn't expect anything else. But the idea that the capitalist class then concede and don't mobilize the petty bourgeoisie as a counter-revolutionary force, at least attempt to, I think is inconceivable. In the same way, in terms of your horrible scenario, Mike, of nuclear war being the most likely outcome, I hope that's not the case. I readily accept that nuclear war is a danger, as along with, ecological collapse. But I would also emphasize that's another reason to stress the internationalism, that we actually need the workers' movement in the United States. And you'll judge, to the extent that you can plan these things. I mean, I think you referred to coordination, simultaneous revolution, and simultaneous revolution can be both because of objective conditions that you describe, but also can be because of subjective reasons, i.e. we in Europe look at what's going on in the United States and say it's a reasonable gamble to go for Europe because the comrades in the United States can stop them using nuclear weapons, that they can limit sabotage, just in again, it's a small example, but it's a real example, that in Britain you had the Jolly George, and of course the significance of the Jolly George, this is the British workers' movement blocking the delivery of munitions to Poland, which is fighting a counter-revolutionary war against Soviet Russia. But the significance is the threat from the TUC to call a general strike. So in other words, you look at the necessity of internationalism, again, both objectively, because we're dealing with a world economy, but also because we want the workers' movement in the United States to curb, to block the counter-revolutionary danger. But again, just to finish, the idea that if you announce now that you're going in for total universal expropriation of the petty bourgeoisie. If there's anything that's guaranteed to drive them or keep them from aligning themselves with the workers' movement, I couldn't think of anything. I can't think of anything, strategically more stupid than doing that. So voluntary, yes, that's absolutely right. Co-ops, yes. A process, yes. But the idea that the proletarian state says every street, pub, every cafe, every building firm, no matter how small, will be expropriated, will be socialized, I think is both economically mistaken, but it's also politically mistaken.
Okay, so try and be as quick as possible. I agree with Moshe that the transition to a planned economy is going to be inevitably, and in fact, it's a Marx's point that there's going to be mistakes, that things will go wrong, that you have to do a lot of trial and error. It's a good point, I think, made by Cockshott and Cottrell, that the computing power now exists to do the calculations which the Soviets couldn't do in the 50s and 60s. I think it's also necessary, even so, Marx makes the point, I can't remember exactly where, that you're going to have to run the economy at generalized relative overproduction in order to allow space, leeway for things going wrong, for adaptations and so on and so forth. And that's very clearly, actually, not just from the Soviet Union, which one of the problems is that they're trying to run the economy too tight. They're not allowing for that degree of leeway. But equally, just the present situation in the NHS, which is the crisis in the NHS as a result of COVID, is a result of them trying to run with too high bed occupancy. Too much, quote, efficiency. And it turns out a lot of the, quote, efficiency gains are inefficiency gains. And the same is true with Tina's remark about the co-op, that in essence, what's wrong with this is that there's not enough leeway. Everything's being run on lean management and just-in-time supply chains. And the lean management and just-in-time supply chains means you're not holding enough stocks to cover contingencies. So that need for surplus. Jack, just on cars, actually that doesn't work. It's true of the supermarkets that they're quite good at controlling. Having said that, in relation to cars, you can look on, you'll probably find them online somewhere, but there's these enormous car parks of unsold cars. Yeah. Great stashes, piles of unsold cars, because the market is not quite predictable enough for the output of the car factories. So the problem of feeding back and the way in which this interplays with Jack's point about living responsibly and Tina's point about unlimited demand and human nature. Okay, it's a standard capitalist liberal economist trope that there's unlimited demand. But if there's unlimited demand, why is the marketing manager of the supermarket constantly moving the location of the goods around in order to induce people to spend more time in the shop and hopefully buy something which they wouldn't think of buying? Why is, okay, I need to buy a new box because for my computer, because my box from 2 or 3 years ago is beginning to run too slow or something like that. I'm not sure quite what I need to do about it, but in essence, it's because bloatware. The business model of the IT industry is to force you to buy the next upgrade by increasing the software demands on the hardware, and thereby by increasing the software demands on the hardware to force you to buy. Okay, if it was the case, and this is not new, this is it was when I was a kid, people were talking about planned obsolescence in the US car industry, particularly the US car industry. When the Morris Minor, when British Leyland went over in Cowley from manufacturing the Morris Minor to manufacturing the Marina, they recalled all the parts for the Morris Minor and had them from the dealers and had them concreted into the floor of the assembly plant. Because the quality of the bodywork for the Morris Minor had been too good, and people were keeping the cars running and running and running and not buying new cars. So that I don't think it quite. On the one hand, it is. It's not quite as simple as we're going to all become quote responsible consumers, as it were. But on the other hand, actually, I don't think that I think that what's happened in the last 60 years in relation to the need for demand management to keep mass production functional is such that it's not simply the case that there's unlimited demand. And you know, in theory, the whole of the population of Oxford could decide to take the 4 o'clock train to London, and a catastrophe would result. But in fact, it doesn't happen. At most, we get overcrowding because Great Western Railways have decided to run a 5-car train rather than a 9-car train. So in any case, so the point is, this is the flip side of it. However, I think the question of internationalism, this is absolutely fundamental, and I think it's part of the problem with the TAS argument. Is that it's TAS comrades' argument is that it is within the framework of the nation state. And Jack is right that we have to, if we're not going to wind up with global nuclear war, we have to develop internationalism. And that means actually that we have to develop internationalism against the perspective of a chain of national revolutions. Because it's all very well, if we think about actually the United States was defeated in Vietnam, it wasn't just, it needed the Soviet Union, it needed China, it needed the heroic resistance of the Vietnamese people to having the ship bombed out of them. It also needed the US anti-war movement. And that was possible because the Vietnamese Communist Party presented itself, and the communist movement internationally presented itself as an international movement. The more that we got Euro-communism and the assertion with Euro-communism that it's nations and nothing but nations, you have to be national. The more we got, even actually not just with Euro-communism, but the other side of it, the people who oppose Euro-communism, it's presented as merely the resistance of the oppressed, and not the internationalism of the movement that stops it. The more actually you don't get the internationalism, you don't get a peace movement on the basis of Saddam Hussein is part of the axis of resistance, or Iran and the Houthis and Hezbollah are part of the axis of resistance. You don't, that we have a mass movement around the Palestine question, but at the same time, it can't reach into the United States in the way in which, with all its madness, create 2-3 many Vietnams could reach into the United States. And in order to do that, well, this is a paradox, and we're sort of a lot of the time arguing against you, but in this one, I'm arguing with you. You need a party, and you need a party which stands for political revolution. And you need a party which stands for political revolution in order to make it possible for cooperatives to work in the interests of the working class and not be merely Mondragon, in order to make it possible for trade unions to actually function for the defense of the working class and not be merely the institutions they are now. If you don't have a party which is a party which takes the aims of political action, then all these things about the uselessness of cooperatives, the uselessness of trade unions, and so on and so forth are true. But equally, also, if we don't have a party which is internationalist and projects internationalism, then we are going to wind up with all our efforts are overtaken by world war, which has already happened in a sense with the collapse of the anti-globalization movement around social forums movement in the early 2000s, because the US turned to imperialist adventures in Afghanistan and Iraq, broke the unity of the movement and utterly and completely disoriented it. That's it. We've sort of wandered quite one way and another. We've wandered quite away from the question of the transition. Yasmin's point is an important one, which is not just because this is, of course, not just a question of the petty bourgeoisie properly so called, but of the middle bourgeoisie, the Mittelstand, the Bazari merchants are sort of in the intersection between petty producers on the one hand and the consumers on the other hand, but also small scale operators of the same sort as the guys who are day traders in the City of London, where in this country the small scale equivalent of that is largely wiped out because it's the banks have taken over the job. However, back to we've had a whole range of issues. The first point I think is, which relates back to the issue that Yasmin's raised, is yes, it's true that we have to think about the transition to communism as a global transition. And that implies that it poses the question not just of the petty bourgeoisie on the British scale or on the European scale, but also of the petty bourgeoisie in the global South. And also, I did say this in the opening, of the people in the informal sector, people who are self-employed in the informal sector in the global South, which is enormous, really enormous. You're talking about absolutely enormous numbers. And that brings us back to, in a sense, Moshe's point and the point that Jack has made. It's just unrealistic to suppose it's realistic, it seems to me, to suppose that there is processes of socialization under capitalism in the lead up to the point at which we can take political power in the form of the creation of trade unions, the creation of cooperatives, etc. Yes, these things are all operating under capitalism. That's also true of trade unions. Trade unions is merely collective bargaining over wages and conditions. But nonetheless, it's a process of collectivization, and it's a process of collectivization. We have seen, Stan referred to miners' welfare institutions in the interwar period. There's a whole load of more stuff about cooperatives of one sort and another in the interwar period. There's plenty of stuff about cooperatives of one sort and another as initiatives of the CPIM in the subcontinent, as the SPD in Germany. What's wrong is if you think that it's no use to say we do the party and nothing else. Because if we set up the party against these various attempts, actually were turning the party not into what Marx and Engels thought the party was, but into something more like Lassalle, who argued the trade unions are a waste of time because capital will always drive wages down to the lowest possible level, and therefore what we have to do is just construct the party, and we construct the party on the demand of universal suffrage. And once we've got universal suffrage, then we're going to fight for state-backed co-ops, and it doesn't fly. The party turns into merely Marx says I think quite correctly, merely a sect. So the second thing is does it solve the problem if we wait for the revolutionary crisis to come and workers' councils will spontaneously form as a result of the revolutionary crisis? No, because we know perfectly well what happens. We've got the experience of it over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. Revolutionary workers, the Bolshevik Party won the majority in the Soviets in Russia because it was already before 1914 the majority party of the Russian working class as a result of its electoral interventions and its other political activities. Mm. The KPD in Germany got absolutely nowhere in relation to Soviets because the social democracy persuaded the workers' councils that they should have workers' councils without parties, which of course meant that the social democracy holding loads of different hats on, just as the Socialist Workers' Party today, you never see them saying that the Socialist Workers' Party, it's always their stand up to racism, their this, that, and the other front of one sort and another. The majority socialists, the pro-war socialists, had control by virtue of being trade union leaders and so on. And we've had similarly the creation of workers' organizations in Bolivia and the inability of the Trotskyists in Bolivia, who were a mass party, Trotskyists in Bolivia, to take the lead of those Soviets, because they were a mass organization, but they had a syndicalist rather than a partyist understanding of what their tasks were, which meant that they wound up tail-ending the syndicalist leadership of the trade unions. We've had much smaller workers' councils in Brazil, and who dominated the workers' councils in Brazil? The Socialist Party and the Communist Party. The Trotskyists and the Maoists were marginal in them. So it is delusion to suppose that the creation of workers' councils will automatically provide. Sure, as in Iran, as far as I understand it, wound up being controlled by the Islamists. Yeah. It is a delusion to suppose that the creation of workers' councils will provide such an opening opportunities. Jim, you referred to the fact, plumbing, you could do the repairs yourself. I used to have an old Hillman Avenger, and I and a mate between us replaced the engine, the clutch, the gearbox, the prop shaft and differential rear axle, and kept the damn thing running for longer than one might have supposed. But I couldn't possibly do that too. Well, you really would. You do need my old Rover, which I used to drive, died when the auto locking mechanism, electronic auto locking mechanism, locked it up, and Rover dealerships had ceased to exist, and therefore there was nobody who had the tech to be able to control the auto locking mechanism. So in that sense, yes, this is another example of capitalism, the force, the means of production, the preconditions for socialism, not only right but getting somewhat rotten. Stan on subsidiarity, I agree entirely. It's an interesting point. There's Noah Rodman has translated on the anarchist libertarian website, a three-part series by Karl Kautsky against state socialism from 1881. And the really rather remarkable feature of Karl Kautsky against state socialism in 1881 is that he comes up with the conclusion at the end of it. In socialism, we'll get rid of the local government. It will all be decided at the national level. It won't be state socialism, but it'll be the nation which decides. Excuse me, what about international? And in fact, of course, Kautsky argued in The Class Struggle in his article on the airport program in 1891 that international trade, under socialism, international trade will be reduced and all decisions were made at national level. Socialism in one country. He's not the first to argue for socialism in one country. That was von Vollmar in the 1880s. And on housework and mod cons, yeah, it is interesting how that was had an ideological character to it, and in particular, again, my parents, my gran used to send laundry to the laundry in the nearest town. She's in the countryside. She used to send it to be collected by the laundry in the nearest town down the road. You know, the development of these domestic washing machines is actually an ideological construct, so that it would be, rather than having people send stuff to the laundry, which was something which was not uncommonly provided in the 1950s, 40s, 50s, 60s, that we go back, we turn it into a new task for the housewife. But that's part of the process of the ideological shift, that there was a real serious effort to drive women back into the home after 1945 in order to make jobs for the heroes coming home from the war. And that ideological shift in the United States and in this country, and I guess everywhere probably, but part of that is we get then the washing machines and dishwashers and stuff like that. Jara Handola referred to, suggested in the chat that it was fundamental to think about decommodification, which I think that is quite important, because what we're doing, if we have the NHS, that is a decommodification of medicine. If we think about free access, there's a sort of there's a battle over commodification and decommodification in the internet, in a sense, because there's a sense in which Google Books is an enormous, is in a sense an enormous decommodification of our out of print books, but at the same time there's a sort of counter effort which Google itself is engaged in, but which other people are engaged in, to set up the recreation of copyrights. So decommodification, I think, is important. Deruling, I'm less clear about what you mean by deruling. My own view, which I argued in a talk which we never printed on individual liberty and class power, is that the transition to socialism will end in, well, the communism will involve us taking turns to be subordinate and taking turns to be responsible for others, rather than that all subordination will end, all responsibility for others will end. That the image of perfect liberty, where you're not controlled by anybody else, is delusional and inhuman. That's my view. So deruling, I'm not quite sure what you mean by deruling, but that's a problematical one. Moshe, you're slave to the computer and the iPhone. In the same way, in point of fact, the guys who worked on the sailing ships in the late Middle Ages were slave to the machine, to the dictates of the wind machine. And the guys who were who brought the flour, bought the grain, and dug out the flour in the windmills and the water mills, and did the kit. Because again, the wind and water machines are just as much dictatorial as the steam machines. And indeed, actually, Joshua Getzler has shown an awful lot of the English textile industry, British textile industry, I should say, in the late 19th century was still water power. They hadn't even gone over to steam around 1900. There's a lot of that's just an additional point. Back to our fundamental issue, it's a sort of, this is a very difficult argument to have. With the comrades in TAS, partly because they need to formulate their own draft program and say what they are positively saying. They say that we say that they're instantaneously talking about instantaneous expropriation of the petty bourgeoisie, but then the things they say, as far as I can read them, amount to saying that they're for instantaneous expropriation of the petty bourgeoisie. The question of, is there a transition? The other question, which is sort of half of this, and which I have only partially, I've sort of been, in talking about socialization under capitalism, I've been sort of leaning towards seeing the positive in what the TAS comrades have been arguing. At the same time, the argument for a rapid transition to Karl Marx's first phase of communism, i.e. that we have labor tokens, a labor tokens regime, I don't think works, but basically because the purpose of the labor tokens regime is to incentivize maximization of output. And it's not at all clear that incentivizing maximization of output is what we actually need to do in a future society. Precisely, we've run up against real natural limits in the shape of global warming, in the shape of plastics pollutions in the ocean, in the shape of species loss, and other forms of environmental degradation. And we need to shift away from orientations which maximize output to orientations which maximize human possibilities, which focus on human possibilities rather than increasing the total output of goods and services produced, or for that matter, economizing on labor, because again, the phenomenon of enormous numbers of people being out of work, enormous numbers of people being out of work, and there's no work for them, not just in the north but in the south. It really is the case that labour is becoming life's prime want. That useful work, as opposed to, or people in what David Graeber called bullshit jobs, useful work is becoming life's prime want. So actually, we need to think about a messy, complicated transition, a transition for which it's useful to think about the experience of the Soviet Union and the former, quote, socialist countries, unquote, which is useful to use Bukharin's Economics of the Transition Period, Preobrazhensky's New Economy as part of our tools. But at the same time, one which isn't a transition to first phase of communism in which everything is owned by the state and you have labor tokens, but to Jara decommodification and shift thoroughly out of the the orientations of capitalism. And I agree with Moshe and with Jack. I just can't see how that can possibly be imagined. I think there will be very rapid, after you've overthrown the capitalist state, there will be very rapid processes of change. Because we've seen that if we overthrow after 1689, there are very rapid processes of change in 1689 to 1720. 1720 looks much more like capitalist modernity than 1688. And the same is true of the French Revolution, that 1810 in France looks very much more like capitalist modernity than 1788. And in the American Revolution, equally, though in the American Revolution it's slower because the United Kingdom, basically the UK is able to hold on to America by way of the slaveocracy as a comprador capitalist class. So that slows down the process. But the modernization in the Yankeedom in the Northeast is extraordinarily rapid. So in that sense, I can see a very rapid process of change. But at the same time, that's not we go to complete communism. I said very rapid process of change. In the 1760s, 1740s, 1750s, 1760s, in northern England, people are still fighting about feudal duties. Landlords are still asserting their right to manorial efforts and so on. But at the same time, you know, as I say, it is difficult to engage in this discussion, but it's difficult to engage in this discussion because it's very unclear positively what the comrades think. That's it.